Hey guys, we begin this story about the craziest body counts in medieval's history. If you stay here, like and subscribe this video, the medieval world was a theater of unimaginable violence. It was a time when faith clashed with ambition, when plagues swept across nations like storms, and when conquerors measured their glory not by the lands they ruled, but by the mountains of corpses left in their wake. The so-called Dark Ages were not just dark because of superstition and ignorance. They were dark because humanity itself seemed obsessed with blood, with death, with the sheer spectacle of destruction. When we speak of body counts today, we think of military victories, statistics, or even slang terms. But in the Middle Ages, body counts were horrifyingly real. They were whispered in terrified rumors, scratched into chronicles by monks, and carried by survivors as living nightmares. Imagine a city where every man, woman, and child is butchered within a week. Imagine an army that turns rivers red with blood, or a disease that kills so many people that corpses rot in the streets for lack of grave diggers. This story is not for the faint of heart. This is the tale of the craziest body counts in medieval history. Moments when death ruled supreme, when humanity revealed its most ruthless side, and when survival itself seemed like a miracle. The Mongol storm in the early 13th century. A child was born in the windswept steppes of Mongolia. His name was Temujin, but the world would come to know him as Genghis Khan, the oceanic ruler, the terror of the East, the scourge of entire civilizations. Where his horsemen rode, life ended. Where his banners flew, cities burned. It is impossible to talk about medieval body counts without first speaking of the Mongols. They were not just an army. They were a force of nature. Unlike any empire before them, they moved with terrifying speed, striking cities hundreds of miles apart within days. Their archers rained death from horseback. Their engineers built siege weapons capable of smashing the strongest walls, and their commanders waged war with icy calculation. But what made the Mongols so infamous was not just their military brilliance. It was their massacres. When the Mongols captured a city, they often killed every single living soul within. Sometimes they spared a few artisans or scribes, but otherwise, the sword fell indiscriminately. Men, women, children, even animals. One of the most chilling stories comes from the siege of Nishapur in 1221. Nishapur, a great Persian city, resisted the Mongols fiercely. When it finally fell, Genghis Khan's son-in-law was killed in the fighting. Enraged, the Khan ordered the city annihilated. According to some chronicles, as many as 1.7 million people were slaughtered, though historians argue the number was closer to 100,000, 200,000. Still, the descriptions are enough to freeze the blood. Streets clogged with corpses, houses turned into charnel pits, rivers running red. The Mongols did not hide their cruelty. They celebrated it. After conquering cities in Persia, Central Asia, and the Middle East, they sometimes built pyramids of skulls as monuments to their power. Survivors were forced to stack the heads of their neighbors into grotesque towers that could be seen from miles away. Imagine entering a ruined city and seeing not temples or palaces, but a mountain of human skulls gleaming in the sun. In Merv, another Persian city, it is said that each Mongol soldier was ordered to kill 300 prisoners. Chroniclers estimate over 700,000 people died there. The numbers may be exaggerated. Medieval sources often were, but the reality was still staggering. What's truly chilling is the Mongols' psychological warfare. Before laying siege to a city, they would send envoys demanding surrender. If the city resisted, its people could expect no mercy. But if they opened their gates, sometimes they were spared. This created a reputation so terrifying that entire towns surrendered at the mere rumor of Mongol armies nearby. People would rather open their gates than gamble with annihilation. For over a century, the Mongols carved a bloody swath across Eurasia. Their estimated body count, tens of millions. Some historians argue that the Mongol invasions may have killed 10% of the world's population at the time. Imagine that. Every 10th human being on Earth, gone. Yet what makes this story more surreal is that the Mongols also created one of the greatest empires in history, fostering trade, communication, and culture across Asia and Europe. The same hands that stacked skulls into pyramids also protected the Silk Road, spreading inventions, ideas, and wealth. But the cost of this Pax Mongolica was written in blood, enough blood to drown nations. The Black Death, if war is mankind's greatest killer, disease is nature. In the mid-14th century, long after Genghis Khan's horsemen had thundered across Asia, another apocalypse arrived, silent, invisible, unstoppable. It came not with swords, but with fleas. It came not with armies, but with rats. And it killed far more than any general ever dreamed. The Black Death, the bubonic plague, swept into Europe around 1347. Ships from the east carried it to Italian ports, and from there it spread like wildfire. Within months, entire towns were depopulated. Within years, half of Europe was dead. The symptoms were grotesque. Victims developed swollen black buboes in their armpits and groins, oozing pus and blood. They suffered fevers, vomiting, delirium. Most died within 3 to 5 days. Some dropped dead in the streets, collapsing mid-step. Others writhed in agony in their homes, while their neighbors barricaded the doors to keep infection out. Monks recorded scenes of horror. In some cities, corpses lay piled like garbage, rotting in the open, because there were not enough living men left to bury them. Dogs and pigs feasted on the dead. Parents abandoned children. Husbands abandoned wives. Fear unraveled the bonds of society itself. The death toll was staggering. Europe's population fell from around 80 million to 40-50 million in just 4 years. That's nearly half the continent erased. In some villages, every last person perished. Digaka. In Florence, it's estimated that 60% of the population died. In London, bodies were dumped into giant plague pits, mass graves where thousands were buried together. But Europe was not the only victim. The plague raged through the Middle East, Asia, and North Africa as well. Worldwide, it is estimated to have killed between 75 to 200 million people. By percentage, it was one of the deadliest events in human history. The Black Death was more than just a disease. It was a trauma that scarred the medieval psyche. People believed it was divine punishment. Flagellants marched from town to town, whipping themselves bloody to atone for humanity's sins. Pogroms broke out against Jews who were falsely accused of poisoning wells. Superstition, paranoia, and despair ruled. What makes the Black Death especially haunting is its speed. A Mongol army might take months to annihilate a city, but the plague could wipe out the same city in a matter of weeks, and there was no army to fight, no walls to hide behind. No surrender that could save you. Death came on the breath of your neighbor, in the bite of a flea, in the very air you breathed. The body count of the Black Death dwarfs the Mongols. For the first time in history, humanity realized that nature itself could kill more effectively than the sharpest sword. When Pope Urban called for the First Crusade in 1095, he promised salvation to anyone who took up the cross. Knights, peasants, and adventurers from across Europe flocked eastward, driven by religious zeal, greed, and the promise of eternal glory. But followed was not divine mercy. It was butchery on a scale the Holy Land had never seen. The march to Jerusalem was long and bloody. Armies carved through Anatolia, massacring Jews and Muslims along the way. When the Crusaders finally reached Jerusalem in 1099, the city became the stage for one of the bloodiest massacres in medieval memory. Chroniclers tell us that when the Crusaders breached the walls, they slaughtered every man, woman, and child they could find. The description from eyewitnesses is chilling. One wrote that the streets ran ankle-deep in blood. Muslims were butchered in mosques, Jews burned alive in synagogues. Some historians estimate 70,000 people were killed in just a few days, a staggering number for a city of that era. For the Crusaders, this was a triumph of faith. For the victims, it was hell on earth, and this was only the beginning. For 2 centuries, Crusaders and Muslim defenders clashed in wave after wave of wars. The siege of Antioch, the battles for Acre, the campaigns of Saladin, each brought more death, more massacres, more mountains of corpses. Religious war did not limit its carnage to the Middle East. In Europe, crusades were declared against heretics, pagans, and even Christian rivals. The Albigensian Crusade in southern France saw the slaughter of entire towns of Cathars. When asked how to distinguish heretics from true Christians, a papal legate allegedly replied, "Kill them all." Kill them all. God will know his own. By the time the crusading era waned, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, had perished in the name of holy war. The body counts were not just numbers. They were mothers holding their children as flames consumed their homes. They were fields of corpses left unburied in the scorching sun. They were echoes of prayers drowned out by the screams of the dying. The 100 Years' War and the blood of Agincourt from 1337 to 1453, England and France tore each other apart in what history calls the 100 Years' War. It was not a single war, but a series of brutal conflicts fought over claims to thrones, lands, and honor. For more than a century, the fields of France became killing grounds, soaked again and again with the blood of knights, peasants, and mercenaries. One of the most infamous battles came in 1415 at Agincourt. The English army, led by King Henry VI, faced overwhelming French forces, but Henry had a secret weapon, the longbow. As French knights charged across muddy fields, volleys of arrows tore them apart. Horses collapsed in heaps, armored men drowned in the mud, and chaos turned to massacre. Estimates vary, but out of roughly 30,000 French troops, as many as 7,000, 10,000 were killed in a single day. The English lost only a few hundred. What made the slaughter worse was Henry's grim order to kill French prisoners, fearing they might rally if freed. Dozens of captured nobles were executed in cold blood. This was just one battle in a century of carnage. Entire villages were burned, crops destroyed, civilians starved. Disease followed armies like a shadow, killing more than swords ever did. Chroniclers spoke of empty fields where nothing grew but weeds over the bones of the dead. The 100 Years' War was less about decisive body counts than endless attrition, the slow grinding death of a continent at war with itself. By the end, France was devastated, its population cut by nearly half through war, famine, and plague. Tamerlane, Lord of Death, builder of skull pyramids if the Mongols had terrorized the world in the 13th century, the late 14th century had its own nightmare, Timur, better known as Tamerlane. A descendant of the Mongol tradition, Timur dreamed of rebuilding Genghis Khan's empire, and he pursued it with a cruelty that shocked even hardened medieval chroniclers. Wherever Tamerlane marched, death followed. He waged wars across Persia, India, Central Asia, and the Middle East, leaving behind trails of devastation. But unlike other conquerors, Timur seemed to revel in sheer brutality. One of his most infamous acts was the sack of Delhi in 1398. After defeating the Sultan's army, Tamerlane entered the city. Before the battle, he had already ordered the execution of 100,000 captives so they wouldn't rebel. In Delhi itself, the slaughter was relentless. Entire neighborhoods were burned, men were cut down, women raped, children enslaved. Chroniclers wrote that the stench of death lingered for weeks. The temperature horror was the pyramids of skulls. After conquering the Persian city of Isfahan, he ordered 70,000 people executed and their heads stacked into towering pyramids as warnings to others. In Baghdad, he did the same, building grisly monuments of human remains. Imagine riding into a city and seeing not banners or gates, but towers of skulls casting shadows across the land. The numbers attributed to Timur are staggering. Some estimate he killed as many as 17 million people during his campaigns, roughly 5% of the world's population at the time. Whether or not the numbers are precise, the terror he inflicted is undeniable. Timur died in 1405 while preparing to invade China. His empire crumbled soon after, but his legend, the blood-soaked conqueror, the builder of skull pyramids, lived on. If Genghis Khan was the storm, Timur was the thunder that followed. Both left behind seas of bodies, monuments not of stone but of bone. The madness of medieval sieges. If battles were storms of steel, sieges were slow-motion nightmares. To be trapped behind city walls in the Middle Ages was to live in a cage with death scratching at the gates. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months, as food dwindled, water ran foul, and disease spread like wildfire. The body counts of medieval sieges did not come only from the sword. Hunger, thirst, and despair did the killing. One of the most infamous sieges was the Siege of Jerusalem in 1099 during the First Crusade. After weeks of blockade, crusaders finally breached the city walls. What followed was not war but extermination. Contemporary sources claim that tens of thousands of Muslims and Jews were slaughtered in the streets. Chroniclers, writing with grim pride, described knights riding with blood spattering their armor up to their knees. Whether exaggerated or not, the massacre was remembered for centuries as a symbol of holy war's cruelty. But not all siege horrors came from swords. At the Siege of Acre in 1189-1191, disease claimed more lives than weapons. Chroniclers described maggot-ridden corpses floating in the sea, unburied bodies heaped outside tents, and armies choking on the stench of rot. By the time Richard the Lionheart arrived to press the siege, tens of thousands had already perished. Starvation was perhaps the cruelest killer of sieges. At the Siege of Antioch in 1097-1098, food ran so scarce that men ate horses, dogs, and rats. Some whispered even darker tales of cannibalism, of desperate soldiers cutting flesh from the bodies of the dead. When the Crusaders finally broke into the city, their vengeance was merciless. Every alley became a river of blood. And yet, the grand finale of medieval siege warfare came in 1453 with the fall of Constantinople. For over 1,000 years, the Byzantine capital had stood as a jewel of Christendom, its walls thought unbreachable. But when the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II brought his cannons to bear, the ancient defenses crumbled. For 53 days, the city resisted. Priests prayed in Hagia Sophia, while defenders patched walls by night. Finally, on May 29th, the Ottomans stormed the breaches. What followed was 3 days of chaos and slaughter. Thousands were killed, tens of thousands enslaved. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine, is said to have died fighting in the streets, sword in hand. The fall of Constantinople was not just a military defeat, it was the death of an empire. In siege after siege, the same pattern repeated. Hunger, disease, desperation, and when the walls fell, massacre. The body counts were not always tallied, but the ground itself bore witness. Bones unearthed by the plow centuries later, ruins stained with memories of starvation and slaughter. Medieval execution, torture, death as spectacle beyond wars and plagues. Medieval life was shadowed by another grim reality: public executions. Death was not only a punishment, it was a performance, a spectacle meant to terrify and entertain. The body counts of war were chaotic. The body counts of execution were deliberate, methodical, ritualized. In cities across Europe, gallows stood as permanent reminders of justice. Criminals dangled from ropes, their bodies swaying for days as crows pecked at their flesh. Beheadings drew cheering crowds. Children perched on shoulders to get a better view as the axe fell. Burnings at the stake turned town squares into theaters of horror. The medieval church played no small role in this culture of execution. The Inquisition sent thousands to their deaths, accused of heresy, witchcraft, or blasphemy. In Spain, heretics were paraded through streets in shameful processions before being consigned to the flames. Entire sects, like the Cathars, were exterminated through mass burnings and executions. In England, traitors faced the grisly fate of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. They were dragged through the streets, hanged until near death, their bellies slit open, entrails pulled out and burned before their eyes, their bodies hacked into pieces displayed on city gates. This was not mere punishment. It was terror made flesh, a warning carved into human bodies. Witch hunts brought another surge of body counts. In Germany, Switzerland, and France, entire villages were swept by hysteria. Old women, midwives, even children were accused of witchcraft. Courts condemned them by the hundreds. Some historians estimate tens of thousands of people were executed as witches across Europe in the late medieval and early modern eras. The cruelty was not random. It was a system. Torture chambers wrung confessions from the accused. Racks stretched limbs until joints popped, iron boots crushed bones, thumbscrews ground knuckles into pulp. These confessions fed the fires, adding to the count. Public executions were often festivals. Vendors sold food, musicians played, lovers strolled hand in hand as they watched a condemned man scream in the flames. Death was not hidden. It was celebrated. Medieval people lived closer to mortality than we can imagine today. To them, a man's final screams were a reminder of divine justice, a spectacle that bound the community together. The ledger of death, what do we make of these body counts? The Mongols leaving pyramids of skulls in Persia, the Black Death wiping out half of Europe. Crusaders drowning Jerusalem in blood. The 100 Years' War grinding two nations into famine and ruin. Timur slaughtering cities into silence. Constantinople falling in fire. Witches burning in market squares. Each episode stands alone in its horror, yet together they form a pattern. The Middle Ages were not merely an age of faith, chivalry, and castles. They were an age obsessed with death on a staggering scale. If we attempt to tally the numbers, they defy comprehension. You Mongols, perhaps 30-40 million dead. The Black Death, between 75 to 100 million. The Crusades, around 1-3 million. The 100 Years' War, millions more through battle, famine, and plague. Tamerlane, as many as 17 million. Executions and witch hunts, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands. By conservative estimates, the medieval centuries witnessed hundreds of millions of deaths through war, plague, starvation, and persecution. That's not just numbers on parchment. That's villages erased, cities emptied, families extinguished. Why tell this story? Why count the dead of 1,000 years past? Because history whispers warnings. The medieval world reminds us that civilization is fragile. Behind every shining cathedral, every knightly legend, lay fields of bones. The Middle Ages were not romantic tapestries of honor. They were soaked in blood, haunted by death on scales that shook entire civilizations. And yet, here lies the paradox. From that crucible of violence emerged art, philosophy, and faith that still shape our world. Cathedrals rose even as corpses filled plague pits. Universities thrived even as armies burned villages. Humanity endured, stumbled forward, rebuilt. But the body counts remain. They are silent witnesses. They remind us that war, disease, and cruelty are not distant shadows. They are threads woven into the fabric of our past. Perhaps the scariest truth is this: medieval history's body counts are not unique. The modern world has found new ways to kill, new plagues, new wars. We are not so different from those who once stacked skulls into pyramids or marched into holy war. The Middle Ages ended, but death's appetite never did.